I studied psychology at the Erasmus University about 15 years ago. And I'll come back in a second on that, but I didn't really learn anything about psychedelics back then. It wasn't in any of the curricula. I think it's starting to get in there a bit now, but of course there had been a lot of research on psychedelics. But it was through personal experiences that I got exposed to psychedelics. First starting with psilocybin truffles, which you have here legally available in the Netherlands, but later also MDMA, LSD, DMT, just trying different psychedelics for myself. I would say like mostly for recreational purposes. So really exploring the mind, having a good time, dancing, but also as a way to take a step back and to see your life from a different perspective. Since 2014, I've been making goals every year for myself and then quarterly check-ins. And so you're doing that maybe in a sober state too, but I found through looking at that maybe less structured, but maybe more, I would say like in creativity research, more divergent, more thinking about different aspects. I think psychedelics really can play a role there. So first really started personal, and then about 5.5 years ago, it wanted to also get professionally involved with psychedelics again. So then started exploring psychedelics in a professional way. And really to do that, I wanted to dive into the research and learn more about what has been written, what did we know, because as I said, during my studies there, really was nothing about psychedelics that was being explored already. So I wanted to learn more about psychedelics and really dive into the research. And this initially started from an idea and perspective of doing coaching with psychedelics. So not per se looking at the therapeutic application, but really looking at how can you answer those questions around where do you want to go in life? Or I'm working through relatively small issues or issues that you can, would do with normal coaching. So wanted to be able to apply that and use psychedelics as that moment, as the way of stepping outside of your normal frame of mind and really exploring it that way. But to do that, I wanted to explore what is the research, what can we say? I knew sort of that basic framework from psychology, but not per se the psychedelic literature. Quite optimistically, I started looking at the research and I thought maybe there's 200 research papers and I'll take a few months to put them together. I knew how to build a website, to make a database, and to give them tags around this is a double-blind study, or this is looking at psilocybin, or this study is around PTSD, and these are the authors. So that's kind of the initiation of of Blossom where I started it. We're now 5.5 years later, and it's grown quite a bit. So kind of from that initial idea, I started exploring. Well, initially there are even more studies than 200. We're now I think at 2,500 or so studies in the database. And every month I now read through abstracts of about 100, 120 articles, and then add about 20, 30 to the database that really add something new to the literature so that they get new angle that are just an experiment or in another way add to the literature. And I guess through that Blossom kind of has become the place where psychedelic research is brought together in one place. Track now both the papers that are being published but also the trials that are happening. So we need to see what is sort of in the pipeline, if you can say that. And next to sort of those individual data points, I try to bring it together in overview pages. So both looking at the different psychedelics themselves, but also at the indications that we're looking to treat with psychedelics. I think a lot of people do know, and think we'll talk about this later, is that psychedelics aren't a indication-specific drug that really only helps in one thing, but that kind of does help with categorization for this. So they kind of led to more and more expansion in terms of covering the psychedelic research. I think over the last 2.5 years, also looking at how can we actually put this into practice. So next to Blossom, I'm working with a US-based consultancy called Delphi, really seeing how can we bring this into practice. I'm working now on a report sponsored by Norske Mind, a Swedish nonprofit, on how do we actually get reimbursement for psychedelics. So I think it is also a different interesting area, but all grounded in research and then seeing how can we actually apply this in the real world. And that's both in the medical system, where I think most of the research is focused on, but also in more of the coaching recreational part, where I also still do part-time do coaching with psychedelics. In psychedelic research, when I started tracking it, there were 2 research centers, Imperial College London and Johns Hopkins. So there's only 2 named psychedelic research groups, and of course more people were looking into psychedelics, but those were just 2 of them. I think nowadays we have 30 or more named psychedelic research centers, and of course even more people looking into psychedelics. And really at that start from before 2019 or even a bit earlier, really the focus was on getting everything started, on doing research with psychedelics again, then looking at areas where that could be possible. So looking at people with end-of-life anxiety, so that you could go to the ethics committee and say, like, these people, like, we're not going to kill them with psychedelics. Of course, a ridiculous idea, but in terms of ethics committees, I think that's how they could be able to convince them. And then over time, you see more and more exploration of psychedelics, both for mental health, but I think also more broadly. And also looking at actually how do they work. I think that's also interesting, right? That we do see sort of the psychological effects and have known about that for quite a while, but now looking more and more into the brain and actually how do they work and what are the pathways that their effects go through. And I'm in no way an expert on that part, but it is really interesting to see, can we understand that better and see how can we promote that. And yeah, I think over time we've been looking into more and more areas where psychedelics can help, and actually going through those phases and actually seeing how can we implement this. And of course, everyone had hoped that in August we would have the green light for MAPS protocol or Lycosis protocol with MDMA for PTSD. That we could actually see this in practice, but I think we have to wait a little bit longer. But I think that's sort of in the clinical part. Yeah, that's really has been accelerating in the last few years. I think outside of more the clinical sections, I'd say I recently co-wrote an article for Blossom on creativity and psychedelics. And I think that's also a really interesting area that people are looking at and have been interested in. I guess also in that initial wave in the 60s and 70s, like how can psychedelics really help? And I think so what I can say about it is that it can help, I think, in general. But then if you really look at the specific measures of creativity, I think there's little evidence if you're really looking at sort of the clinical markets of it. But if you look more broadly at sort of coming up with new ideas and then actually like working through it when you're back in a sober state, I think there's really an interesting things that can happen. And now there's also more independent research groups. I think one is called Minds. They are really looking at like how can we actually do this in the real world. So I think that's an interesting area. And then maybe what I also see what wasn't around in 2019 is seeing how can we go from the psychedelics that we know, both the classical but also MDMA and ketamine, how can we go from those to novel molecules that maybe work faster, so they're more easily applicable in a clinical setting. No one can, or at least in the clinical system, we can't really support people with an LSD trip. It's like usually maybe last 10, 12 hours, but sometimes, and that's been seen in the research, it can last 18 hours and someone still has to be there. So can we really make that more fit in with the current system, which of course then maybe some people don't want it to fit in, but that's what people are looking at. But also looking at how can we improve the safety of psychedelics, so make sure that the heart rate doesn't go up that much, or there's not a prolongation between sort of the heartbeats. And so to see how can we make the psychedelics that are there more safe. And that's, for instance, one thing people want to look at and are investigating with ibogaine and seeing can we make a novel molecule or can we add something else like magnesium to make it safer. So I think those are really interesting areas, and I think that's all still in that more clinical and that research phase with both universities and for-profit companies going after that. I think that's a really interesting area where we will probably see that more in the real world in maybe 5 to 10 years. If you look at population surveys and surveys around people who are using psychedelics, I think we're in the right area. In the 70s, of course, a lot of people were using psychedelics, but I think if you look at a lot of the measures, more people are using psychedelics right now than they were using in the 60s, 70s. So I think in that way, we're sort of in the golden era, and of course, all of the tools and how we're researching things, those have also developed. If you look at some specific areas, I think really investigating how are people using psychedelics ceremonially or using it in a coaching or therapy practice that isn't licensed. I think that's also a place where we can learn so much. Some clinical trials have been conducted really well in terms of how the patient is experiencing it. Of course, there's also been reports that the challenging psychedelics experiences project with Jules Evans and others have written about is that sometimes those circumstances in clinical trials are really sterile and not really what people want. Of course, there's been articles about nature relatedness and seeing like, oh, do people want to be outside or see the outside or sort of have other things that can make the psychedelic experience work better? And something that's coming up more and more, and that's what you see happening more naturalistically after clinical trials, so people find others that have gone through the trials and offer peer support and seeing how is that currently already being used and can we learn more from peer support, both I guess in psychedelics, but maybe also outside of psychedelics, and learn how can we actually apply that to the more medical application of psychedelics. If you look really at the data, sort of the large data sets around psychedelic use, I do know that one of the early stage drug developers called Mind State Design, it really took all those trip reports and went through them with an AI program and said, okay, which one of these molecules will be interesting to develop? They're looking to make novel molecules, but now I think they just recently started with their phase one of a molecule that has been around, but hasn't been studied yet. So they kind of took that from those experiences and see, can we really explore this molecule with the rigor of science? And I guess another molecule that I think is popular here in the Netherlands is called 2CB. I think Alexander Shulgin's favorite molecule is also something that has really briefly been explored in terms of therapy, of couples therapy, but yeah, hasn't really been researched much yet. I would say maybe there's 10, 15 articles that we've covered on Blossom. So I think that's also one that has been used way more in recreational settings, but hasn't been studied that much in the clinic yet.